and he's in my tarot of the gods. Has an honoured place. So those 19th century and 18th century Freemasons who were radical liberals interested me intellectually, because I realised a lot of the history of Europe suddenly began to make sense. And I discovered that where did they come from intellectually? They came from the Renaissance rediscovery of Hermeticism. Particularly important was a figure called John Dee in England. They rejected the oversimplistic idea of God as the tyrant behind the universe that we have to bow down to and worship. No, God dwells in us, through us, and as we intellect, as we evolve, we can build a relationship of knowledge with that divine. And John Dee wrote a foreword to Euclid's great treatise on geometry in England. He was a mathematician from Cambridge. And I think what happened was in the 17th century, these guys who clustered around Dee and Francis Bacon, who was like his protege, in fact, decided that we had to rethink our relationship to knowledge and to God. God shouldn't be just there revealed in a sacred book. You just do what it says and you don't ask questions. No, God is the mystery that is behind everything, and we can rise to it, as Francis Bacon said, by a winding stair. Using mathematics, using geometry, using architecture as a kind of allegorical language, because ultimately God is the beauty within existence and revealed. And that was the beginning of scientific method. Bacon and Dee and those early Freemasons, they were doing two things. They were creating, they were in favour of life, so they were saying the secrets of life are hidden, but we can find them out. Let's create a method. We'll call it science, which is simply the Latin word for knowledge, right? And I think what they did at the same time was they created a Masonic series of rituals to give spiritual strength to the scientists and to the seekers of wisdom. They drew partly on Rosicrucian ideas, and earlier esoteric Christian, but especially Hermetic ideas. Well, this was all pretty revolutionary stuff, and where it spread, it spread to France in the course of the 18th century. There were French Masonic lodges active, and most of the intellectuals of France became Masons. Some of the great names we all know about, Montesquieu, one of the great Enlightenment thinkers, and many, many others in Paris. There was a lodge called the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, named after the Nine Muses, I discovered, which we almost know nothing about, except that Thomas Jefferson was a member. It was called the UNESCO of the 19th century. The UNESCO of the 18th century, because it had the great economists, and the founder of economics, Quesnay, was a member. The founder of chemistry, Lavoisier, was a member. People that were doing pioneering work from Russia to Spain to America. The Freemasons were like a network where they could meet and share ideas. That led to the Enlightenment, which led to, ultimately, there had to be a political manifestation of this. That took the form of democracy. You see, if we're starting with scientific method and you and I can have different hypotheses, and who's right is the guy that can prove it intellectually, then we have a democracy at work. Science is supposed to function like a democracy. So where these ideas went, they brought in political democracies. They brought in constitutions, political revolutions sometimes, as in America and France, and then that spread. And in Britain, where we got democratic ideas in power. Was it a tool of oppressive colonialism? I think that there were some colonialists who, and and have been, who were Freemasons. And I'm not by all means denying that some Freemasons are attracted by the power thing, the power craze, you know. I mean, I think one of the worst Freemasons of modern history is a guy in Norway who joined the Masonic Lodge in Oslo in order to get its secrets, was a fanatical right-wing conspiracy theorist guy, and then he went onto an island in Oslo Bay and shot 70 Social Democrat kids at a summer camp in the name of his own twisted kind of ideology, which was anti-Islam, anti-socialism. Now, I don't know why on earth the Oslo Freemasons didn't detect there was something odd about this guy and didn't screen him out. I think people have infiltrated them. But by and large, I think they've done more good in the world than bad. And let me, okay, so there was a conspiracy theory going back to your father, right? Very early on, just after the French Revolution, when right-wing French Catholics and other Catholic Christians, with quite a narrow view of what Christianity is, decided that Freemasons were the devil's work and they were responsible for the French Revolution. And therefore, wherever a Freemason popped up his head, they should be shot and killed. That idea was very influential in right-wing Roman Catholic circles in the kind of darker sides of Catholicism in European history, sadly. And it lived on, and it resurfaced in the anti-Semitic diatribes of the Nazi undergrowth in 20th century European history, which was influenced by right-wing Russian emigres, who were also anti-Freemasonry, because the Russian Revolution had also, the first liberal revolution, which challenged Tsardom and the autocracy idea. Russia had a brief liberal spring with the Duma and a kind of parliamentary government. And there were a lot of Freemasons involved. Kerensky, the prime minister, was a Freemason, right? They wanted a liberal Russia in which people would have freedom and the ability to set up their own businesses and generally have human rights. Russia had only just lost serfdom, which was a form of slavery. But unfortunately, Lenin seized power illegally and using violence with backup from Trotsky and Stalin and some pretty unpleasant guys. And they immediately began an anti-Masonic witch hunt. And in Russia, Freemasonry was abolished by the Bolsheviks. Right up until the end of the Communist Party in 1990, no Masonic lodges were allowed. And there was a huge anti-Masonic Bolshevik propaganda thing going on. Now, the Nazis were doing the same. So the extreme right and the extreme left were both anti-Masonic because they were the liberal constitutionalists in the middle that wanted to do things legally. The Nazi Party was founded on two twin poles, anti-Jewish and anti-Freemasonic. How did they muddle the two? Because in Europe, the Freemasonic membership club was about one of the only places you could go if you were either a Christian or a Jew or something else, you know, a Hindu or a Sikh or just a seeker of knowledge, you know. And you could be Protestant or Catholic. It had religious toleration as its founding thing when you walk in the door. And anti-Semites didn't like that. They didn't want Jews to associate with, on an equal footing, with Christians and others. So, and that had been a feature of the right wing of the Catholic Church ever since the Crusades. When these right-wing crusaders attacked and captured Jerusalem from the pretty tolerant Muslims, they slaughtered everyone there who were Muslims and Jews. And the streets of Jerusalem ran in with blood, Jewish and Muslim blood. So another big influence on the history of Freemasonry is Kabbalah, which is esoteric Judaism. And so a lot of Freemasons have been experts and specialists in the history of Kabbalah. And anti-Semites hate all that. They just don't want Jews to have any good thing about them, you know. And the rhetoric and propaganda became absolutely horrendous in the Nazi era. They were called vermin and scum, and you know that led to the possibility of demonising them so much that they go for the gas chambers and the wiping out of a whole people. You know, if my argument is true, and I believe it is, that actually these amazing Jewish people who are so unbelievably intellectual, you know, I've just been reading about Hannah Arendt, for instance, who survived the Holocaust. I think probably the wisest woman philosopher of the 20th century, who wrote about all this totalitarianism and stuff, saw it happening, stood for everything the opposite of what Hitler stood for. You know, Hitler wasn't an intellectual. None of his Nazis were. They were just thugs. So, yeah, I think it's a really interesting history, Freemasonry. And when it went to Africa, I think it's done all kinds of interesting stuff. And I'd love to know, I don't think it's been written, the history of Freemasonry in Africa. I don't think it's been written yet. There are black lodges in America called the Prince Hal Freemasons. And I can tell you, for instance, that Reverend Jesse Jackson is a member of that, who is one of the most important Democrat, you know, friends of Martin Luther King, on the left of American politics. So there's a history of black Freemasonry in America and in Africa that's not yet been written up. And it would be fascinating to see it. I've just started the beginning of a conversation about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
And the French thing you alluded to, yes, I mean, when Napoleon went to Egypt, I mean, Napoleon was a mathematician and a kind of intellectual. He just ended up in the army. And really, he was fascinated. He was a Freemason. Most scholars don't realise this about Napoleon. There was a huge, you know, uprising of Freemasonry in Napoleon's era. He wanted to preserve the best bits of the liberal revolution, like freedom of, you know, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and all this stuff that the French Constitution guaranteed. He supported all that. He was a man of the Enlightenment, but he didn't want the excesses. He wanted order instead of chaos, and that was what Freemasons want. They want some kind of order on the streets of Paris, not chaos. And Napoleon loved Egypt, and it was due to his inquiring nature that we eventually translated the hieroglyphs, because Champollion, who was also a Freemason, great Egyptian scholar of French origin, came from near here, had the intellectual wherewithal to translate these hieroglyphs. And so this sort of spread like wildfire among the Masonic lodges of France, particularly in Paris, and they started re-invoking Isis and the Egyptian gods and goddesses. And it's a fact that Ptah was the god of Freemasons in Egypt, who've left us all these amazing stone pyramids and temples. They're still standing, you know. To be a master mason in Egypt was a very, very important thing. We know the names of, for instance, Imhotep, one of the great sages of Egypt, who was an architect and mason. And they saw building temples to the gods as like a really sacred thing to do. And I suspect, and my French scholars, there's a lot of Egyptological work in French, which I can read, they believe that Freemasonry, although it was, you know, we think it was revived in the 16th century, they say no, it goes further back to ancient Egypt. This is the ancient Egyptian religion still alive. And it was about Ptah, who was the great architect of the universe. And it's interesting that in Egyptian, we know this from Egyptian art, Masons wore a little apron thing if you were working with Ptah. And that is the badge of a Freemason. It's like a priest of Ptah, you know. So it's like, I think they were right to make these links. You know, it's interesting.
Thanks for that.
Okay, you're welcome. Yeah, I mean, you know, just the tip of the iceberg. There's more we could go into about the goddess, and you know, like what's the theology behind all that. But it was very open and evolving. I mean, if you have a chance when you're in Paris, go to the Grand Lodge of. There's a museum in Paris for the history of Freemasonry, and you can see all this stuff. You can see details of the, you know, the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, and it's really worth seeing. There's also a library there, which I have been in. You know, there's a whole French research going on into the history of Freemasonry, and its Egyptian and African dimensions.
Right. So coming back, and I will say that for a bit later. Questions about Khadija. Right. So this colonial, you know, I think there's some mention towards the civil wars that have taken place in Africa, right? And the sort of like in you know, I think compelling Africa to make a step toward, you know, asserting peace or advocating peace in Russia and Ukraine. There's this mention about that, you know, peace could do us all well toward the civil wars and internal conflicts within Africa. And I think, like, the way I understand a lot of these civil wars is that they manifest out of the sort of colonial baggage of that sort of internalized other, which then finds its depository internally onto one faction or another. That internalized inferiority that came with the colonial savage, which came with the manufacturing of the Negro. And I mean, like, something that's just been ringing in my head ever since I heard it. You know, I watched this talk by James Baldwin, and he asks the question that, like, you know, the world's not going to move forward until the white man, or the white world and the Western world, answers the question of what was the purpose of them creating the Negro. Why? What was the necessity of that? And, you know, and I think that there's something. I mean, one of my favorite films is Spartacus.
Sure.
And I think it was just very important for me to watch Spartacus in the midst of decolonialization movements happening in South Africa, and seeing Spartacus, you know, he's a slave, and he's white. He's a white slave. It blew my mind. And I mean, I've seen The Prince of Egypt, and I knew that the Jews were slaves, but just kind of seeing the story and being like, this phenomenon of human oppression, of dehumanizing one group of people, it's been around since, like, the dawn of time, right? Something we've been wrestling with since we learned how to attempt to organize society and become civilized. And civilization was then accrued to those who stood above the savage, barbaric other, right? And I think my question, or I think something to discuss maybe, would be the sort of purpose that served within in the Western world, within Europe, and how that sense of civilization, right, founded on the eradication of savagery and barbarism, which are, like, good things to eradicate, don't get me wrong, right? You don't want to be living in a world where people are chopping people's heads off and raping people and, like, you know, throwing superstition on each other. Like, we don't necessarily want to live in a world that's ruled by the paranoias of those particular forces. And I think my question is like asking about, well, what was the purpose of this of civilization in Europe, of the sort of origins of empire on some level, and how that then decided that it was a good thing to extend itself to the rest of the world. Because I feel like we're at a place now in our history where we're kind of seeing through this idea of empire. We're seeing through this idea of civilization and the sophisticated society, which is like, you know, you kind of, you're born, you go to school, you learn to behave yourself and to have manners and to be civilized, you know, wear your pants in public and all these things, right? But then like kind of learning about how those ideas were like brutally imposed on cultures, you know, to the point of being like, you have to do this thing in the name of God and Jesus because your civilization is savage otherwise, it's undignified otherwise, it came with violence, it came with blood sacrifice. And I don't know, I think in my understanding of what civilization is, or a peaceable society is, it's not one that's like killing each other over ideology. It's not oppressing people over ideology. It's not containing people because it's like proper, because it's like right. But like the peace that we exist in is peace. It's a shared felt agreement between one another. And I think my question in my life, right, has been to trace back like this thing of looking at another human being and being like, you're different, and that's like scary, and I need to contain you, and I need to delete you from reality, right? I need to manufacture a new identity for you, and I need you to then have it and take it and only live by that. Otherwise, like, alles is net chaos, you know, it's too much disorder that I can't interface with, I can't deal, I have to put you in a box. I have to say that this is what you are. And I want to know what the history of that is in Europe and within Europe. I think, like, you know, as we've been speaking about like Druidry and this idea of like, I think like the thought experiment of going to the park to smoke a joint, right, and the sort of like can of worms that opens is that it becomes like the squares versus the liberals again, you know, about the people, the conservatives, the right versus the left. That whole thing, like that whole story is so alive in what that transgression of, you know, us just peaceably being free with nature would sort of like invoke in the sort of perception of this particular village or this particular set of two different people, right? One's like a bit of a barbaric, uncreative, unscientific, irrational sort of creature, and the other is holding on to a sort of well-behaved, good person, good Christian valued morality, right? And what is that in Europe, you know? I mean, because that thing definitely came to Africa in full swing. It came to South Africa in full swing. It came many countries, you know, on the continent. That thing of saying that you don't fit in the box. Now I need to put the box on you.
Well, there's like loads of questions you've raised in that, and they're all very interesting, you know, to go into them all. I'll start with the first one. What is civilization, you know, and why did Europeans think that it should be exported? Well, what's the history of that, you know? That's an interesting question, and it's got to do with classical history. You can't understand European history till you've studied Greek and Roman history, and as part of that, Phoenician, Egyptian, the whole Mediterranean region, which was eventually caught up in Greek and Roman history and Phoenician. So that takes us back to about 1000 BC. And I think the Greeks, I'm not saying they invented the idea of civilization, but they had this notion that the other was the barbarian. It was a Greek term for the other, outside of history, you know. And the whole idea of history began that concept. Herodotus, the father of history, he was very interested in all cultures. Everyone has a history. So he maps the history of the whole Mediterranean. He goes to Egypt, interviews people. He wants to know all the stories. He goes to Phoenicia. Whether he got to Persia, we don't know, probably not. But and that was history, which means inquiry. It doesn't mean stories about the past, it meant inquiries about the present, which all then lead to stories about the past. The Greeks had got the alphabet very early on, so they were able to write their stories down in the great works of Homer and Hesiod. And they constructed this sort of worldview or cosmology or religion that the gods are in charge of history, and we humans are, to some extent, they're playthings, but we are, what we ought to be doing is to be on the side of the good gods and to be appealing to the gods' better nature to give us an easy ride here, because it's a tough life. And that creates certain ethical codes of duty, like honour, truthfulness, loyalty, courage. And that became the civilizing code, if you want. For men, it was often bound up with warriorship, because that was the testing ground. To be a proper man meant you had to be, an honourable warrior. That's certainly in Homer and the Iliad. And not to be a coward, not to run away, to meet your death if you have to. But also there were certain rules. You don't engage in slaughter, you don't rape and pillage, you don't, you fight a clean fight kind of thing. That was part of the ethics of this. The Greeks then began this extraordinary intellectual journey where they went to Egypt, they explored Phoenicia. Pythagoras went to Egypt, he went to Phoenicia. His dad was Phoenician, his mum was Greek, so like he was himself a multicultural guy. And he went to Babylon, which is where the really exotic other lived. Babylon was like, what? That's really like decadent, and they worship funny gods. But he went there and learned from them. And by tradition, he even made it as far as India. So he was a polymath who wanted to see the wisdom of all cultures and all races and all religions, put it together into a sort of an inner initiatory journey, which he called philosophy. He coins the word philosophy in about 550 BC and sets up a school in southern Italy where he's teaching the spiritual path that is called philosophy. Plato inherits that mantle, takes it to Athens, sets up the academy, which was running for 1,000 years, and gradually it became. Oh, and also very important to this was the Greek mysteries that were going on in Eleusis, where they were taking psychedelics. Their souls were experiencing the gods. They were not just studying the gods in poetry and books. They were encountering the gods, particularly the goddess Demeter, who's the mother goddess of nature, who gives us all our food, and we're all children of hers. And so they were and to be a civilized person meant you'd done the mysteries in Eleusis. That meant you were like part of Greek culture, right? Because you encountered the gods, and that made you pious. It made you humble. It made you a lover of the gods. Now that was the real quality of Greek civilization at its best, which then spread. And that became the Hellenic ideal, if you want. It meant that you understood philosophy, you understood the mysteries, you had humility before the gods, but also not stupid, dumb humility, an inquisitive humility. You were on equal terms to some extent. You had the right to ask, what's going on here, you know. And that's why Socrates wouldn't renounce the right to question. And Plato founded the academy in his wake. So intellectual freedom became one of the hallmarks of civilization. The Romans came late to the party. They were a bit more brutish than the Greeks. They were more, but they did have that sense of piety and honour, and they inherited the Platonic academic inquiry, you know, through people like Cicero and other great Roman thinkers, Varro and others. And in fact, the founder of Roman religion was a very interesting man who called Numa Pompilius, who seems to have been a historical figure, a real guy, who initiated Roman religion and built the first temples and instituted the first festivals in Rome in order to tame their martial quality, because Rome was a sort of bit roughnecks, kind of, you know, a bit too much into violence and stuff. And Numa Pompilius, who was not Roman, who was a Sabine, was invited to be their second king. And he said, I'll only accept that job if you let me bring in religion, which he did. And we know about his life because it was written down in a very important book called by Plutarch, who was a Greek priest at Delphi and an amazing philosopher and intellectual in like a couple of centuries after Christ. So Christianity's around, but it's a minority thing. Plutarch ran the Delphic Games, which I'm fascinated by. The Delphic Games became also an important part of that story of Greek civilization and Roman. And Plutarch realized that the Romans and the Greeks were similar but different. So he wrote this biographical study called Parallel Lives, where he takes a famous Roman and a famous Greek who are similar but different and writes their biography. And he writes the story of Numa Pompilius. I think he compares it to Theseus, who was a kind of mythical king of ancient Athens. And it's a source of information on Numa Pompilius, who was... So the Greeks accepted the Romans as civilized. They let them be part of the story, the narrative. And that's why Virgil wrote his great poem, the Aeneid, copied on Homer. And so that's where European civilization begins. That's in fact, the idea of Europa is she was a princess from Phoenicia, Europa, a Semitic princess who was taken to Crete, and Crete is an important cradle for all this stuff. Zeus is born on Crete. I've been to Crete. It's part of Europe, but in that bigger sense. And, you know, it's the question of like what went wrong, what happened. I think we can't ignore the fact that the Christianization of that classical world happened. And, you know, that then left an imprint on later colonial apologetics. The British Empire was founded on sort of, we're going to Christianize the savage. We're going to teach them to sing hymns in Black Africa, you know, and missionaries would go out and you know, sing hymns and stuff. And the Catholic Church was behind that in other parts of the world, in Indochina, for instance, which became part of the sort of French Empire of the 19th century. The Germans got to this very late. They